So some interviews on The Gist are because I just needed to know, and some interviews are because you needed to know, and some interviews are because, I'll admit it, I owed someone a favor. But sometimes those wind up being really, really good interviews. This is a different kind of interview, and it's one that is designed to pretty much unlock the key to my existence, the core of my being, the mystery at the center of the soul. I'll take you back about 10 years, and there in the New York Times was an article called The Feel-Good Gene. It was written by Richard Friedman, and it talks about what is called, and maybe this is his dubbing, the bliss molecule, anandamide. And we'll get into it more. We could get into the endocannabinoid system, why it works, how it works, but I've never in my life before read an article or a piece of literature where I said more, that explains me. This is exactly what's going on with me. So Richard Friedman, the professor of clinical psychiatry and director of the psychopharmacology clinic at Weill Cornell Medical College, joins me now. Hi, welcome to The Gist.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Welcome, and welcome to the bliss. Did you invent that? The bliss molecule, the bliss gene?
Well, I mean, anandamide means the bliss in Sanskrit. So right. I didn't invent it.
You just translated it from
exactly.
from Sanskrit, but which was good of you, yes. So explain what it is and how it works in that order. What is it, and then what's the effect?
So anandamide is a naturally occurring so-called cannabinoid, nature's own cannabis that exists in the brain of humans and also other, non-human primates. And it's very important in the brain in regulating mood and appetite and anxiety, all kinds of behaviors. And it's one of two endogenous, meaning natural to us, endogenous cannabinoids in the brain. The other is something called 2-AG, which is lesser known. But anandamide is the cannabinoid in the brain that stimulates the cannabinoid receptors, which is the target of cannabis that people, smoke, eat, vape, etc.
And in fact, is that how they found it? They did a reverse engineer asking the question, wait, why does cannabis work?
Well, that's a profound question because we have receptors in our brain for all kinds of consciousness altering states. And so the natural question always is when you find these receptors, and sometimes you find them because you're using your reverse engineering, you're using recreational drugs and then tagging them and studying where in the brain do they go. And then you find out where they go and you say, what is this receptor doing in the brain? And what is the natural molecule in the brain that operates at that receptor?
Yeah, so every drug works in an analog to a chemical in the brain. Otherwise, it wouldn't have an effect on the brain.
Exactly. I mean, we recognize these molecules because we evolved for, millions of years surrounded by them. And we've been exposed to them. If they're truly foreign, it has no effect at all.
And to be a bit more clear, it is not really the case that we have chemicals that are like marijuana and we're hitting ourselves with marijuana. It's more the case, I want you to describe it, that these chemicals bond to receptors that we have and either limit or increase the amount of naturally occurring substances or chemicals that affect our mood. Is that a better way to think about it?
Yeah, it's more like we have these naturally occurring substances, but the ones that humans use are often either a little stronger than the ones in our brain or given at much higher concentrations than the ones that occur naturally in our brain. So, for example, if you smoke a joint or you vape, you're delivering an amount of cannabinoid to your brain that's much higher concentration than what naturally occurs in your own brain, meaning the anandamide is there at very low levels. And but when you smoke marijuana, you basically flood the brain with, THC, which is a cannabinoid that binds the receptor, and you get a big effect.
So someone self-diagnosed like me who feels that the effect of the systems that you're talking about, who feels the effect of anandamide, and again, self-diagnosed, how will such a person who has higher than normal levels feel? They won't feel loopy, right? They won't laugh at things like someone who's high. They won't speak slower like Fish in the Grateful Dead. How will it show up typically, someone with perhaps elevated levels of anandamide?
Anandamide. Right. So there's a variation in humans about the level of naturally occurring anandamide. And if you have a lot of it, let's say, you're above the mean, if you were, first, you wouldn't want to use as much marijuana. You would be not so interested in using it. And if you did use it, it might actually not be so pleasant. You might have a negative reaction because you've got your own, naturally occurring cannabinoid at a level that's high enough so your anxiety level is probably lower at baseline than average.
Lower anxiety, effects of marijuana doesn't work. What about the munchies and obesity?
You probably still would have an appetite increase. Even if you had elevated anandamide, if you smoked cannabis, it would still exert appetite.
What I mean
effects.
is I walking around, again, self-diagnosed with elevated anandamide, am I hungrier than most?
Oh, that's interesting. Not in the clinical studies of, anandamide, they didn't notice that people who had higher levels of anandamide were either heavier or consumed more food.
Mm. What are some other characteristics of anandamide, the elevated anandamide community? Now it's a community, and I'm looking to be mayor.
So lower levels of anxiety, lower drug seeking, less likely to want to use cannabis, and probably other drugs as well, maybe alcohol. And another thing that's very interesting about people who have higher levels of anandamide is they learn and can learn to be unafraid more easily than the rest of us.
Yeah. So I would say of your checklist, check, 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 and check. And then I think I read, I don't know if it was in your article or some of the other study, there's a weird effect with chocolate. Do you know about this?
No.
Okay. I'll leave the chocolate to the side. Now, there was a very famous, I believe, British woman named Jo Malone, who was found to have this molecule, but also another, or maybe it was more of something about her genetic sequence, but also she feels no pain. Are you familiar with her?
Yes. That's a different genetic variation having to do with pain signaling and the perception of pain, right? So she's got naturally occurring analgesia. And because she feels no pain, she's in danger always of being injured because she can't tell whether she's stubbed her toe or broken a bone or burned her skin. It's a dangerous syndrome.
It's dangerous, but she's led a great life without too much grief, and she's always happy, and it annoys people. There is the FAAH, the fatty acid amide hydrolase, and then they actually have a number for the single nucleotide polymorphism. What's that? How's that apply to anandamide that me and the anandamide community might have?
Okay, so this is the key. That enzyme is the key to why some people have normal, some people have low, some people have high levels of anandamide. So FAAH, fatty acid, it's a fatty acid hydroxylase. And basically, it's an enzyme in the brain that degrades anandamide. It chews it up, degrades it. So if you have low levels of this enzyme, you have higher levels of anandamide. And if you have higher levels of this enzyme, which is chewing it up and degrading it, you have lower levels. So if you have a mutation in your enzyme, in your gene that makes this enzyme, and you lose function of the enzyme, you're walking around with higher levels of anandamide. So it's a loss of function.
Yeah, a loss of function that results in you being quite happy about things.
Exactly. And on the other hand, if you had a gain of function mutation where your enzyme was more active than average, you would have lower levels of anandamide and have higher levels of, let's say, baseline anxiety potentially. And also you would enjoy marijuana. You would want to use it.
Yeah. Yeah, you would seek it out. And in fact, at least in the anecdote that starts off your story, either that's how you got into it, literally that's how you found out about it, or that's what sparked your curiosity about this, a very heavy cannabis user.
Yeah. And why some people have no interest at all.
Yeah. So let's talk about the implications of what you're saying. I guess a decade or so ago, the concept of, well, what is personality or what is depression? Something like the wiring of your head. And then if you get a little more complex, something like the genetic or chemical makeup of your brain. And someone like you would know about that a little more in depth, but this was the lay understanding of how the brain worked. And it was usually used to express some sentiment like we shouldn't stigmatize people who suffer depression, let's say, or we should think about them in a way analogous to someone who's suffering some physical malady, like a broken bone. There's physical components. It's about chemicals. Then when I started reading your story, or maybe even before it, sort of like a receptor looking, or sort of like a gene looking for a receptor, I did say to myself, well, might it not be the case that even positive affect or even a buoyant personality is not just that you have the right outlook on life? It's the same thing. It's just another side of the chemical wiring in your head, if you want to think about it that way. I mean, have you considered that perhaps all of the human experience, human cognition, and mood is just some positive or negative aspect to what I'm talking about?
Right. So it's an appealing idea. And I think there's definitely a biological contribution to mental states, happiness, the tendency to be happy or buoyant, and the mirror image, the tendency to be gloomy and given to negative outlooks. At the same time, psychology, non-biological factors, they do have a big effect. Just think of your own emotional responses to stresses or sad things. We're very easily influenced by the environment and by, those around us. It's just that some of us have a genetic loading and there's an interaction between our genes and our biology and the environment. So there are some people who, let's say, in response to stress, they don't get that anxious. And even when they're heavily stressed, they barely get anxious. And on the other side, there are people who have the best environment, most protected environment. They've got everything. They're financially secure, people who love them, and they have desperate depression.
Yeah.
And they're addicted to drugs. So it's what we call gene environment interaction is a way to think about the outcome between what you've got genetically and biologically and what kind of environment you find yourself in.
Right. Nature determines the range and nurture hones you in on that range. Nature determines that's the genetic range of possible reactions, outcomes, affects, as I said before. And then, your environment, and maybe if someone like you is good enough, your reactions to the environment, your ability to use techniques to not be overwhelmed by the environment, that determines a lot about your personality and your mood.
Yeah, and also it's not fair in a way because people inherit certain genetic variants that have that either increase or decrease their burden
Yeah.
So it might be, for some people to maintain a good mood or be less anxious in the world, they have to work much harder than others.
Yeah.
And not because they're weaker, but because, genetic variants that they have give them an advantage or a disadvantage. Life is unfair that way.
Well, it's unfair in the way that someone could be a 2-pack-a-day smoker and not die of lung cancer, and then someone who never smoked can die of lung cancer. I mean, there's all this variation. It's not. I think with physical things, yes, we know it's not fair. We know some people are taller and some people get diseases, or some people are a bit healthier. We probably don't say it's not fair about that. Maybe we need to totally reconstruct our concept of what fairness is. I don't know what the baseline of mental health fairness should be assumed to be.
Yeah, right. But also the attitude that we take toward people who are ill, especially with psychiatric illness or drug abuse, is usually moralistic. You just need to suck it up and be stronger. It's a weakness, as opposed to actually these are real illnesses, diseases, and it's not entirely in your control at all.
It's not entirely in your control, but I'm sure because you've advised many people over the years to get not just psychopharmacology, but some form of therapy, that it's somewhat in your control, which doesn't take off because if it's not in your control, then why even work on it? Then why even use techniques like biofeedback or techniques that work, right? So,
right.
I'm not one to stigmatize, or I'm not one to blame. Blame is not useful, but within the range of the genetically and environmentally determined, there are some interactions, some interdictions that we could do that maybe moves the needle a little bit. And just know that it's determined by forces outside ourselves, or maybe literally inside ourselves, inside our brains.
Yeah. I think there's actually a lot that people can do with their own biological genetic constraints.
Yeah, or their predispositions. Now, I want to ask you, if you were a different kind of medical doctor and people came to you and they were showing effects of a malady, you might reach for genetic testing as the first thing. But that, from what I understand, that is not usually done. Psychiatrists don't know the baseline of anandamide within their patients, or FAAH. Should they? Wouldn't it help them?
It's an interesting question. It might help them understand a little more why somebody likes to use cannabis.
Yeah.
But often the kinds of information you get from genetic testing, you can infer clinically by observing someone's behavior. It can cut both ways. I mean, let's say you do the genetic testing, you find out that someone's got a variant that, predisposes to low levels of anandamide. Then what would you do? That information could be useful and cut both ways. The person could say, you see, I just was born this way, and so I'm simply doing what nature's demanded of me. I'm supplementing my low anandamide. Right. So, I have no control over this, but actually you do. You can decide there are other things to do. So I don't think it would be so useful. It's useful in understanding the biology behind the behavior that leads us more or less, prone to wanting to do this. But at the moment, the actual clinical usefulness is limited.
Yeah, I don't know. I think maybe that could change. I understand what you're saying, but the first you said that clinically you could get to the same conclusion as one may be able to do with genetic testing. But that's probably true with jaundice, right? That's probably, if you ask a liver specialist, I'm sure they would say, and if they're very good, 9 times out of 10, I could figure out exactly what's going on just based on external observation. But then again, they might get the test and it might help them. And the other thing I would say is, it could, if the doctor said, the genetics said you're at a low level of anandamide, that's why you're doing it. It could help you rule it out. If the test comes back and says, actually, you're not at low levels of anandamide, there's something else going on here, it might be useful to try to get to that something else.
Yeah, but you would go after that something else even if you didn't have the test.
Yeah.
Because let's say you know somebody is abusing a drug or using a lot of it, it leads you to think, okay, they may be self-medicating for an untreated anxiety or depressive disorder or any number of those things. But I mean, there aren't that many tests that we do in psychiatry looking at genes, mainly because a single mutation only contributes a tiny amount to the overall behaviors that humans have. It's not like in, let's say, a classic genetic disorder that is like a Mendelian dominant, like hair color or eye color, or sickle cell anemia. If I do a gene test on you in any of those issues, I'll get an answer.
It's
and
determinative,
I can say to you,
right?
Exactly.
Right.
I will know from the gene what the phenotype is, what the physical trait is going to be. In behavior, genes, you need hundreds, if not more than hundreds of genes to give you, to account for a lot of the behavior. It's polygenic. It's many, many, many variants.
Yeah. So in the literature, and I think you quote this literature, it is said that 15%-ish of the public has what I have, self-diagnosed, elevated levels of anandamide. How would they possibly know that if they don't do massive testing?
Well, actually, you do a representative sample of the population. Let's say you do, whenever you make an inference about a population, you have a sample population. Let's say it's 100 people or 200 people, and then you look at the distribution of the results, and from a sample, you make an inference about the world.
Oh, yeah, I understand that. But they've done that? They've done that with anandamide?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. And what do they find out about those in my community?
So and that's where this comes from. In other words, that 15 to 20% is the prevalence in a sample, in a small, representative, randomly, a random representative group of people, that about 15 to 20% have this mutation, gain of, a loss of function, meaning higher anandamide.
There are so many books and self-help programs and podcasts. Oh, the podcast doctor, about happiness and this quest for happiness and how, the number one class at Yale is about happiness. What if it were the case that, okay, we could cut through this and there is still a lot to be gleaned, but you should just know that the people who are doing it right, a vast majority of them or some huge disproportion of them just are genetically wired that way. Wouldn't that be useful in terms of all the people who are downloading all those podcasts?
Yes, it would be useful. It would be helpful, especially for people who have a hard time being happy. They might not blame themselves, but then they're still going to want to know, what do I do to be happy? Okay, I've got this, genetic marker that puts me at a risk for being anxious. So I just have to, accept this, but then try to incorporate all these behaviors and practices to be happy. So we all have all kinds of unknown genetic, variants that probably contribute to things like this.
What percentage of the population have some psychological disorder, if I'm using the wrong term, you tell me, that might warrant psychological care, therapy, or intervention?
So it depends whether you mean like a really serious psychiatric illness or having any problem at all. It's probably about 40% lifetime. 40.
Yeah.
Like that. So it's a very large number. And when people hear that number, they say, wow, how can you possibly say that 40% of 338 million Americans have a psychiatric problem? If that's the case, it's kind of like saying, well, if everyone has a problem, then no one has a problem. Mm-hmm. What are you doing? Are you including people who just have everyday unhappiness? Probably. There's probably, it's inflated with, and we want to focus on people who really are struggling as opposed to, I'm having a bad day. Meaning, like not every bad feeling or bad day means you're depressed. maybe we should be a little stricter about how we define it. So I would say at least 25 to 30% of the population.
So the reason I ask that is, what percentage of people in your field, psychiatrists, are mostly administering to people who are not doing well versus the percentage that mostly concern themselves with those in the anandamide community, or similarly, people who are happier or less anxious than the mean?
It's a great question. Well, I mean, there are not that many psychiatrists in the country, maybe 150,000 of them. And, they all live in New York City. And I'm joking.
Yeah,
but the distribution so that they're on the coast. And so the availability of mental health care and treatment is so limited in the country. This is a national problem. And in some way, the shame of the nation that, so much psychiatric illness goes unidentified and untreated. So I'd say there's two weird things that we do. One is we medicalize everyday distress, and we tell people to think about themselves and monitor their feelings. And it's all well intended because we want people not to feel ashamed of having a psychiatric problem and get help. But I think one unintended consequence is maybe by doing this, we are encouraging people to think that their everyday unhappiness is something that requires professional help when often it doesn't. That's one side of it. But the other side is we're also avoiding and not treating people who are seriously mentally ill, like people with bipolar disorder and major depression and schizophrenia, because about half of them get treated. Yeah,
I just want to note that is absolutely true. I wouldn't want any of the 150,000 or so psychiatrists to get out of the field. We need more of them. And also that line between resilience and destigmatization. If you destigmatize something and you're so focused on destigmatizing, you could you could normalize. Let me say it this way. If you're so focused on destigmatizing, it could tip over into telling everyone who has not terribly serious conditions, don't be afraid to come forward and talk about and think about how serious your condition is. And I've talked to other people in your field, and they will talk about resilience, and they'll talk about the effects of perseverating on what could be, a normal range of experience. So, given, stipulated, all of that, I do think that it is interesting, though understandable, for triage reasons. There's this huge range of human experience from the unhappy to the happy, and almost none of the studies, some people who are, poking at the lab rats and the receptors we're talking about, maybe in a lab, but very few people are really focusing on the unanxious and the happy. And I do think that some lessons or some more data can be gleaned from them. That's my instinct.
Well, it's interesting because that is not usually a clinical sample, because people who are not anxious and people who are happy, by definition, never want to see psychiatrists.
Yeah.
They're just enjoying life and they feel good, and they've won the genetic psychosocial sweepstakes.
Right. They're not in the picture. But think about physical health, doctors. There's a lot of fitness influencers. There's a lot of medical doctors who will tell you, how to work out and to be extremely fit and buff and feel really healthy physically. Yeah. Not as much of that being done in the psychological realm. It's just more the absence of psychological distress rather than the presence.
I agree with you. I mean, the one thing that I think has been studied, probably the best study like this along the lines of what you're suggesting, just look at people who are not a clinical sample, like just, a people that are followed over the long run. The study,
the Harvard happiness longitudinal study. Yeah,
exactly. Where you're taking people by definition who are graduates of Harvard are a non-representative sample in some ways. You know, they're highly educated, they are probably financially secure, all kinds of things. But even within the group.
For decades, they used to be white men only. Yeah.
Exactly.
There weren't women in that study for a long time.
Exactly. Yeah. So you have to take that with all the caveats. It's not representative. But even within the group, there are interesting things about how important, like the most important factor that correlated with happiness was your social network. The richer your social network, the happier you were. The more contact with people, the happier you were, the better adjusted you were, the more satisfied you were. It was the most consistent finding.
I got to tell you, if you added on to that the anandamide score of everyone, and you found out that there was this huge correlation between having elevated levels of anandamide, being these genetic freaks like myself, and people who are outgoing, it would tell you something. It would tell you something like all this advice that we've been given, you know, get out there more and have a bigger social circle. It is very hard if you aren't naturally predisposed. I don't know what the action items would be, but it does seem like that would be knowledge that would be very useful beyond here's the keys to happiness. If we could also supply, and here's the percentage of the population that essentially don't have easy access to those keys.
Yeah. Yes. If you know that you've got, let's say, the harder genetic hand, you were just dealt the harder genetic hand. You will also know that you're going to have to work harder to feel happy.
How likely is it that from the rough checklist that you provided that I went down and said that all applies to me, how likely is it, just from my reading of it and descriptions, that I'm right, since I've never had an actual test, that I'm right that I have this mutation that gives me elevated levels of anandamide?
There's a good chance you're right. But because there are other variants that relate to happy temperament, you may have other protective genetic variants that, let's say, are producing the same result, but it's not anandamide. There are many. You could be genotyped. We could find out if you have the feel-good gene or not.
Richard Alan Friedman is an MD, professor of clinical psychiatry, and director of the psychopharmacology clinic at the Weill Cornell Medical College. Thank you.
My pleasure.